Sarah Martinez had always dreamed of serving her country. Growing up in a small Texas town, she watched military documentaries with her father every weekend. When she turned 18, she enlisted in the Army without hesitation. Her parents were proud but worried. They knew their daughter was strong, but war was unpredictable. After 2 years of intense training, Sarah became a combat medic. She was skilled with her hands and quick under pressure. Her commanding officers noticed her talent for staying calm during emergencies. When the opportunity came to join a special reconnaissance unit, Sarah volunteered immediately. She wanted to make a real difference. The mission briefing came on a Tuesday morning in October. Intelligence had located a group of American civilians trapped in a hostile territory. They were aid workers who had been providing medical assistance to local villages when fighting broke out around them. The enemy had surrounded their compound, and traditional rescue methods were too risky. Sarah's unit was tasked with infiltrating the area and providing medical support during the extraction. The plan seemed straightforward on paper. They would move in under cover of darkness, secure the civilians, and extract to a safe zone where helicopters could pick them up. Sarah packed her medical supplies carefully, checking each item twice. The team consisted of 8 soldiers, including Sarah. Their leader was Sergeant Mike Thompson, a veteran with 15 years of experience. He had seen combat in 3 different countries and was known for bringing his people home safely. Sarah respected him greatly and trusted his judgment completely. They flew into the region on a transport helicopter just after midnight. The landscape below was dark and mountainous, with small villages scattered throughout the valleys. Intelligence reports indicated enemy movements in the area, but nothing their team couldn't handle. Sarah felt the familiar mixture of nervousness and excitement that came before every mission. The helicopter dropped them 3 miles from their target. They would have to move on foot through difficult terrain, staying hidden from enemy patrols. Sarah adjusted her pack and checked her weapon one final time. The weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders as they began their march into hostile territory. The first 2 hours passed without incident. They moved silently through rocky terrain, communicating only through hand signals. Sarah's training kicked in automatically, and she found herself scanning constantly for threats while keeping pace with the team. The moonlight provided just enough visibility to navigate safely. As they approached the target area, Sergeant Thompson called for a brief halt. Through his binoculars, he could see the compound where the civilians were trapped. Enemy soldiers had set up checkpoints around the perimeter, exactly as intelligence had predicted. The situation looked manageable, but they would need to be extremely careful. Sarah's heart rate increased as they prepared for the final approach. She thought about the civilians waiting for rescue, probably scared and hoping someone would come for them. This was why she had joined the military, to help people who couldn't help themselves. She was ready to risk everything to complete this mission successfully. The team split into 2 groups for the approach. Sarah went with Sergeant Thompson and 2 other soldiers, while the remaining 4 created a diversion on the opposite side of the compound. The plan was working perfectly until everything went wrong in an instant. Enemy reinforcements arrived just as Sarah's group reached the compound wall. Someone had tipped them off, or perhaps they had been spotted during the approach. Suddenly, the quiet night erupted into chaos. Gunfire echoed off the mountains as enemy soldiers surrounded their position from multiple directions. Sergeant Thompson immediately called for extraction, but the radio crackled with bad news. Enemy anti-aircraft weapons had been moved into the area, making helicopter rescue impossible until they could be neutralized. The team was trapped with the civilians they had come to save, and their situation was deteriorating rapidly. Sarah found herself separated from the main group during the initial firefight. She had been treating a wounded civilian when explosions forced everyone to seek different cover. Now she was alone in a small storage building with 2 injured aid workers, surrounded by enemy soldiers who were closing in fast. Her radio had been damaged during the retreat, leaving her unable to communicate with her team. Through a small window, she could see muzzle flashes in the distance where her fellow soldiers were fighting. She had medical supplies and ammunition, but no way to reach safety or call for help. The wounded civilians looked at her with hope and fear in their eyes. One was a doctor who had been shot in the shoulder, and the other was a young nurse with a head injury. They were depending on Sarah to keep them alive and find a way out of this nightmare situation. As enemy voices grew closer outside the building, Sarah made a difficult decision. She would have to stay hidden and wait for an opportunity to escape or for rescue to arrive. Moving now would likely get all three of them killed. She whispered reassurances to the civilians while preparing for a long and dangerous wait. Hours passed slowly in the cramped hiding place. Sarah treated the civilians' wounds as quietly as possible, using torn fabric to muffle any sounds. Outside, sporadic gunfire continued as her team fought to stay alive and complete their mission. She wondered if anyone knew she was missing or if they assumed she had been killed. The enemy soldiers searched the compound methodically, checking every building and room. Sarah held her breath each time footsteps approached their hiding place. She had positioned herself between the door and the civilians, ready to fight if discovered. Her hand never left her weapon as dawn approached on the horizon. When morning light began filtering through the small window, Sarah realized their situation had become even more desperate. Enemy soldiers were setting up a more permanent presence in the compound, making escape during daylight nearly impossible. She was running low on medical supplies, and one of the civilians was developing a fever that needed immediate attention. Sarah closed her eyes and said a silent prayer for her team and for rescue to come soon. She had trained for situations like this, but the reality was far more intense than any exercise. All she could do now was wait, stay alert, and hope that someone would remember she was still alive behind enemy lines. Back at the forward operating base, Sergeant Thompson was fighting his own battle. He had managed to extract 5 members of his team along with 3 of the trapped civilians, but the mission had gone terribly wrong. Enemy reinforcements had arrived faster than anyone expected, turning what should have been a simple rescue into a full-scale firefight. The debriefing room was tense as Thompson explained the situation to his commanding officer, Colonel James Harrison. Maps covered the table, marked with red circles indicating enemy positions and known threats. The news was not good. Sarah Martinez was missing, presumed dead, along with 2 civilians who had not been accounted for during the chaotic extraction. Thompson slammed his fist on the table in frustration. He had personally trained Sarah and knew her capabilities better than anyone. She was tough, smart, and resourceful. But the odds of surviving alone in hostile territory were slim. Enemy patrols were actively searching the area, and air support remained impossible due to surface-to-air missile threats. Colonel Harrison studied the intelligence reports grimly. The political situation was complicated, and mounting a large-scale rescue operation would require approval from multiple levels of command. Time was running out, and each hour that passed reduced the chances of finding Sarah alive. The enemy was known for not taking prisoners, especially American soldiers. Meanwhile, Intelligence Officer Lieutenant Rebecca Chen was working frantically to gather information about Sarah's possible location. Satellite imagery showed the compound where the team had been trapped, but the resolution wasn't clear enough to identify individual people. Radio intercepts suggested that enemy forces had captured someone, but the details were unclear and possibly unreliable. Thompson refused to give up on his missing soldier. He had promised Sarah's parents that he would bring her home safely, and he intended to keep that promise. Against orders, he began planning an unauthorized rescue mission with volunteers from his unit. They would go in light and fast, with or without official approval. The volunteers included 3 soldiers who had served with Sarah on previous missions. They knew her fighting style and could predict how she might react in a survival situation. Corporal David Kim had grown up in the same Texas town as Sarah and considered her like a sister. He was determined to find her regardless of the risks involved. As night fell, Thompson's team prepared their equipment for an unauthorized mission. They would have to move without air support or backup, relying entirely on stealth and surprise. The plan was simple but dangerous: infiltrate the compound area, locate Sarah and any surviving civilians, and extract before enemy reinforcements could respond. Lieutenant Chen discovered a piece of crucial intelligence just as Thompson's team was preparing to leave. Radio intercepts indicated that enemy forces were planning to move prisoners to a more secure location within 48 hours. If Sarah was alive and captured, this might be their last chance to rescue her before she disappeared completely. Thompson made the difficult decision to wait for official authorization rather than risk his entire team on an unsanctioned mission. He approached Colonel Harrison with the new intelligence and requested immediate approval for a proper rescue operation. The colonel was sympathetic but explained that higher command was reluctant to risk more lives for someone who might already be dead. The debate continued through the night, as precious time slipped away. Military bureaucracy moved slowly, even in emergency situations, and each level of command required convincing before approving such a risky operation. Thompson grew more frustrated with each passing hour, knowing that Sarah's chances of survival decreased with every delay. Unknown to the command structure, Navy SEAL Team 6 was operating in the same region on a classified mission. Their commander, Lieutenant Commander Jack Sullivan, had been monitoring military communications and was aware of the missing soldier situation. SEALs had a reputation for helping fellow service members, regardless of branch or official orders. Sullivan approached his team with an unofficial proposal. They could modify their current mission slightly to include reconnaissance of the area where Sarah was believed to be trapped. If they found her alive, they had the capability to conduct an immediate extraction without waiting for Army approval. His team agreed unanimously to help their fellow American soldier. The SEAL team was already equipped for operations in hostile territory. They had advanced communications equipment, night vision technology, and a helicopter on standby for emergency extraction. Most importantly, they had the authority to make tactical decisions without seeking approval from multiple command levels, giving them flexibility that the Army team lacked. As Sullivan's team prepared for their modified mission, Sarah was enduring her second day in hiding. The wounded civilians were getting worse, and she was running dangerously low on medical supplies. Enemy patrols had searched their hiding place twice but hadn't discovered the concealed entrance behind a stack of supply crates. The young nurse, Maria, was showing signs of serious infection from her head wound. Sarah had used most of her antibiotics and was worried about sepsis setting in. The doctor, although wounded himself, was helping as much as possible. But they both knew that Maria needed immediate medical attention, that Sarah couldn't provide with her limited supplies. Food and water were also becoming critical issues. Sarah had found some emergency rations in the storage room, but they wouldn't last much longer for 3 people. The compound's water supply had been cut off during the fighting, leaving them dependent on a few bottles that the aid workers had been carrying when the attack began. Sarah spent hours listening to radio chatter on her damaged communications device. She could pick up fragments of conversations, but couldn't transmit clearly enough to indicate her location. Several times she heard references to search and rescue operations, giving her hope that someone was still looking for survivors from her team. The psychological pressure was enormous. Sarah had been trained to handle stress and isolation, but the responsibility for 2 civilian lives weighed heavily on her mind. She found herself talking quietly to the unconscious Maria, partly to maintain her own sanity and partly hoping that familiar voices might help the injured woman fight through her medical crisis. Enemy activity around the compound had increased significantly. Sarah could hear vehicles arriving and departing regularly, suggesting that the location had become some kind of command post or staging area. This made escape even more difficult, but also meant that any rescue operation would face heavily defended positions with numerous hostile forces. On the 3rd night, Sarah heard the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors in the distance. Her heart raced with hope, but the aircraft seemed to be moving away from their location rather than approaching. She wondered if it was a rescue mission that had been called off, or an enemy helicopter conducting patrols to prevent exactly the kind of rescue she was hoping for. As dawn approached on her 4th day in hiding, Sarah made a desperate decision. Maria's condition was critical, and waiting longer would certainly result in her death. Sarah would have to risk exposure by trying to reach a better medical facility or find supplies elsewhere in the compound. It was a gamble that could get them all killed, but doing nothing was also a death sentence. Lieutenant Commander Jack Sullivan crouched in the pre-dawn darkness, studying the enemy compound through high-powered night vision equipment. His SEAL team had been conducting reconnaissance for 6 hours, mapping enemy positions and searching for any sign of the missing Army medic. The intelligence reports had been accurate. The area was heavily fortified with at least 30 hostile soldiers. Sullivan's team consisted of 4 highly trained operators, each with specialized skills. Petty Officer First Class Marcus Rodriguez was their communications expert and could hack into enemy radio networks. Chief Petty Officer Tom Bradley was their explosive ordnance specialist, capable of creating diversions or breaching obstacles. Petty Officer Second Class Alex Chen was their sniper, providing overwatch and precision fire support when needed. The 4th member was Petty Officer First Class Danny Morrison, a medic with advanced trauma training. Sullivan had specifically requested Morrison for this mission, knowing that any survivors they found would likely need immediate medical attention. Morrison carried specialized equipment that could stabilize critical patients during high-stress extractions. Rodriguez had been monitoring enemy communications for hours, picking up fragments of conversations in multiple languages. Most of the chatter was routine patrol reports, but he had detected references to prisoners being held somewhere in the compound. The information was vague, but it suggested that someone was being kept alive, possibly for interrogation or prisoner exchange. Sullivan made the tactical decision to move closer for better reconnaissance. His team had located what appeared to be a storage area on the eastern edge of the compound, where enemy activity was lighter. If prisoners were being held, that building seemed like the most likely location based on the patrol patterns they had observed. The approach required crossing 50 meters of open ground under the observation of enemy sentries. Sullivan's team moved with the silent precision that made SEALs legendary among special operations forces. They used shadows and terrain features to remain invisible, communicating only through hand. Signals and shared understanding developed through years of training. Together, Bradley deployed motion sensors around their approach route to provide early warning if enemy patrols changed their patterns. The devices were virtually undetectable and would give the team precious seconds of warning if hostile forces moved in their direction. Every precaution was necessary in such a dangerous environment. As they reached the target building, Chen found an elevated position that provided overwatch of the entire area. His sniper rifle was equipped with a silencer and night vision scope, allowing him to eliminate threats quietly if the mission was compromised. Chen's presence gave the team confidence to proceed. With the more dangerous aspects of their reconnaissance, Rodriguez discovered that the building had motion sensors and alarm systems that would alert enemy forces if triggered. Using specialized electronic equipment, he carefully disabled the security systems without leaving any trace of tampering. The process required absolute precision and steady hands, as one mistake would bring dozens of enemy soldiers down on their position. Sullivan and Morrison prepared to enter the building while Bradley and Chen maintained security outside. They had no idea what they would find inside. It could be empty, filled with enemy soldiers, or contain the prisoners they were hoping to rescue. Every possibility required different tactical responses, and they had to be ready for anything. The building's interior was dark and filled with storage containers and equipment. Sullivan and Morrison moved methodically through the space, checking each potential hiding place for signs of prisoners or enemy presence. Their night vision equipment revealed details that would be invisible to normal human sight, but the search was still slow and dangerous. After 20 minutes of careful searching, Morrison detected something unusual near the back of the building. A stack of supply crates had been arranged in a way that didn't match the random placement of other equipment. Someone had deliberately created a concealed space behind the containers, and there were faint signs of recent human activity in the area. Sullivan signaled for Morrison to cover him, while he investigated the suspicious area. As he moved the crates aside carefully to avoid making noise, he discovered a hidden entrance to a small storage room. Inside, he could make out the shapes of 3 people lying on the floor. One appeared to be a soldier in American uniform, and 2 others were wearing civilian clothes. The soldier was awake and immediately raised her weapon when she saw movement at the entrance. Sullivan quickly identified himself in a whisper, and Sarah Martinez nearly cried with relief when she realized that American forces had finally found them. She had been hiding for 4 days, watching her patients deteriorate while hoping, desperately for rescue that she had begun to think would never come. Morrison immediately began examining the 2 wounded civilians while Sullivan assessed Sarah's condition. She was dehydrated and exhausted but otherwise uninjured. The 2 aid workers were in much worse shape. The nurse had developed a serious infection, and the doctor was showing signs of shock from blood loss. Both needed immediate medical evacuation. The situation presented a complex tactical problem. The original plan had been reconnaissance only, but they had found living prisoners who would die without immediate medical attention. Sullivan had to decide whether to extract the prisoners immediately or call for backup and risk losing them if enemy forces discovered their hiding place. First, Sarah provided crucial intelligence about enemy movements and the layout of the compound. She had been observing patrol patterns for days and knew exactly when and where guards would be positioned. Her information would be invaluable for planning an extraction route that avoided the heaviest enemy. Concentrations Rodriguez reported through their communication system that enemy radio chatter had increased significantly. Someone might have noticed the disabled security systems, or perhaps they were conducting a routine prisoner check. Either way, time was running out, and any delay would make extraction exponentially more dangerous for everyone involved. Sullivan made the command decision to proceed with immediate extraction. His team had trained for exactly this type of situation, and waiting for backup would likely result in the deaths of the wounded civilians. The SEAL team had the skills and equipment necessary to get everyone out, but it would require perfect execution under extreme pressure. Morrison administered emergency medical treatment to stabilize the wounded civilians for transport. He used advanced medications and techniques that bought them precious time, but both patients needed surgery within hours to survive. The extraction would have to be fast and smooth to avoid jostling that could worsen their injuries. Bradley began preparing explosive charges to create diversions during the extraction. The plan was to trigger explosions on the opposite side of the compound, drawing enemy attention away from their escape route. Timing would be critical. Too early and the enemy would have time to respond. Too late and they would be caught in the open. Chen repositioned himself to provide sniper support for the extraction route. His job was to eliminate any enemy soldiers who threatened the team during their movement to the extraction point. With wounded civilians slowing their pace, they would be vulnerable for an extended period while crossing dangerous terrain. Sarah gathered her remaining medical supplies and prepared to assist Morrison with patient care during the extraction. Despite her own exhaustion and stress, she was determined to help save the civilians she had protected for 4 days. Her knowledge of their medical conditions would be crucial for keeping them alive during the dangerous journey ahead. As Sullivan's team prepared to leave the building with their rescued prisoners, enemy voices could be heard approaching their location. Someone had definitely noticed something unusual, and a search was beginning. The window of opportunity for a quiet extraction was closing rapidly, and they would have to rely on speed and firepower rather than stealth to escape. The sound of enemy boots grew closer as Sullivan made rapid hand signals to his team. They had perhaps 2 minutes before hostile forces would discover their position. Morrison and Sarah worked frantically to prepare the wounded civilians for immediate transport, while Bradley armed his explosive devices and Chen adjusted his sniper position for maximum coverage. Sullivan's original extraction plan involved a quiet withdrawal to a helicopter landing zone 2 kilometers away. That option was no longer viable with enemy forces actively searching the area. He quickly formulated an alternative plan that would require his team to fight their way out while protecting 3 additional personnel, 2 of whom were seriously wounded. The new plan was dangerous but achievable with proper execution. Bradley would create multiple diversions with explosive charges, drawing enemy attention to different areas of the compound simultaneously. This would create confusion and divide enemy forces, giving Sullivan's team small windows of opportunity to move toward their backup extraction point. Rodriguez established communication with their helicopter pilot, Lieutenant Sarah Williams, who was orbiting the area in a modified Black Hawk equipped with advanced defensive systems. Williams had been monitoring enemy communications and was aware that the situation had become significantly more complex than originally planned. She was prepared to provide close air support if necessary. Morrison had stabilized both wounded civilians enough for transport, but they would need constant medical attention during the extraction. The nurse, Maria, was barely conscious and required assisted breathing. The doctor, although more alert, had lost significant blood and couldn't walk without support. Sarah would help Morrison manage both patients during their escape. Enemy voices were now directly outside the storage building, and Sullivan could hear soldiers discussing search procedures in their native language. Rodriguez translated quietly. They were planning to check every container and hiding place systematically. Discovery was inevitable within minutes, so the team had to move immediately, regardless of the risks involved. Sullivan signaled for Bradley to initiate the first diversion. A series of explosions erupted on the western side of the compound, followed immediately by shouts and rapid movement as enemy soldiers responded to what appeared to be an attack from that direction. The diversion worked perfectly, drawing most of the nearby guards away from the storage area. The team moved quickly but carefully, with Morrison and Sarah carrying the unconscious nurse between them, while the wounded doctor leaned heavily on Sullivan for support. Chen provided overwatch from his sniper position, eliminating 2 enemy soldiers who spotted the group during their initial movement. His silenced rifle ensured that the kills went unnoticed by other hostile forces. They had covered only 100 meters when enemy soldiers discovered the empty hiding place and began shouting alerts throughout the compound. Bradley triggered his second set of explosives, creating another diversion, but the enemy was now aware that prisoners had escaped and began organizing a systematic search of the entire area. Rodriguez detected radio communications, indicating that enemy reinforcements were being called in from nearby positions. The extraction window was closing rapidly, and they would soon face overwhelming numbers of hostile forces. Lieutenant Williams reported that she was moving to the primary extraction point but might not be able to remain in the area much longer due to increasing enemy activity. The terrain between their current position and the extraction point consisted of rocky hills with limited cover. Moving wounded civilians across such difficult ground while under enemy fire would be extremely challenging. Sullivan made the decision to modify their route, accepting longer exposure time in exchange for better cover and more defensible positions. Chen relocated to maintain overwatch of the new route, using his mobility and advanced training to stay ahead of the moving group while providing continuous security. His sniper rifle proved invaluable as enemy patrols began appearing along their planned escape route. Each eliminated threat bought precious time for the slower-moving group to advance. Maria's condition deteriorated significantly during the movement. The stress and physical exertion of being carried across rough terrain caused her vital signs to become unstable. Morrison was forced to stop several times to provide emergency medical treatment, using Sarah's assistance and their combined medical supplies to keep the young nurse alive. Bradley continued creating diversions with his remaining explosive devices, but enemy forces were adapting to the tactic and no longer responded with their entire available strength. The diversions still provided some benefit by creating noise and confusion, but their effectiveness was diminishing as enemy commanders implemented more disciplined search procedures. Halfway to the extraction point, Sullivan's team encountered an enemy patrol that couldn't be avoided or eliminated quietly. The resulting firefight lasted only minutes, but alerted every hostile force in the area to their exact location. From that point forward, they would be fighting a running battle against multiple enemy units converging on their position. Sarah proved her worth during the firefight, maintaining medical care for both wounded civilians while also returning accurate defensive fire when necessary. Her military training and combat experience allowed her to function effectively under extreme pressure, while managing responsibilities that would overwhelm most soldiers. Morrison was impressed by her competence and dedication. Rodriguez established contact with Sergeant Thompson's Army unit, which had finally received authorization for a rescue mission. Thompson's team was moving toward the compound from a different direction, potentially creating another diversion that could help Sullivan's group reach their extraction point. Coordination between the two rescue efforts required careful timing to avoid friendly fire incidents. Enemy forces were now actively pursuing Sullivan's team with organized units supported by vehicle-mounted weapons. The sound of engines and heavy gunfire indicated that the situation was escalating beyond what a small special operations team could handle indefinitely. Time was running out and they needed helicopter extraction immediately, or they would be overwhelmed by superior numbers. Chen reported that enemy anti-aircraft weapons were being moved into position around potential helicopter landing zones. Lieutenant Williams would have only minutes to complete the extraction before surface-to-air missiles made flight operations impossible. The coordination required between ground and air elements would have to be perfect to succeed. The wounded doctor began showing signs of shock as blood loss and physical stress took their toll. Morrison administered emergency medications to stabilize his condition, but both wounded civilians were reaching the limits of what field medicine could accomplish. They needed surgical facilities immediately, making successful extraction a matter of life and death. Sullivan's team reached a defensive position within sight of the extraction point, just as enemy forces began surrounding the area. Multiple hostile units were approaching from different directions, and the window for helicopter extraction was measured in minutes rather than hours. Everything now depended on split-second timing and flawless Execution under the most dangerous possible circumstances. Lieutenant Williams reported that she was beginning her approach to the landing zone, despite heavy enemy fire directed at her aircraft. Her helicopter was equipped with defensive systems, but they provided limited protection against concentrated ground fire from multiple positions. She would have one chance to land, load passengers, and escape before enemy weapons made further flight impossible. The final phase of the extraction would require Sullivan's team to cross 200 meters of open ground while carrying wounded civilians and fighting off multiple enemy units. It was the most dangerous part of an already extremely risky mission, but there was no alternative if they wanted to save the lives of everyone they had found behind enemy lines. Lieutenant Sarah Williams gripped the controls of her Black Hawk helicopter as enemy gunfire erupted around her aircraft. She had flown combat missions in multiple theaters, but this extraction was among the most dangerous she had ever attempted. Surface-to-air missiles were being positioned throughout the area, and her window of opportunity was measured in seconds rather than minutes. The helicopter's defensive systems detected multiple radar locks from enemy weapon systems. Williams executed evasive maneuvers while maintaining her approach to the landing zone, using terrain features and electronic countermeasures to avoid incoming missiles. Her crew chief, Sergeant Jake Martinez, manned the door gun and provided suppressive fire against ground targets threatening the extraction. Sullivan's team was pinned down by heavy enemy fire just 200 meters from the landing zone. Chen had exhausted most of his ammunition providing sniper support, and Bradley was down to his last few explosive devices. Enemy forces were closing in from 3 directions, and the team's defensive position was becoming untenable under concentrated assault. Morrison and Sarah struggled to keep both wounded civilians alive under combat conditions. Maria had lost consciousness again, and her breathing was becoming increasingly labored. The doctor was alert but weak from blood loss and shock. Both patients needed immediate evacuation to survive, but reaching the helicopter through enemy fire seemed impossible. Rodriguez maintained constant communication with multiple friendly units, coordinating the complex extraction while monitoring enemy communications for threats. Sergeant Thompson's army team had engaged enemy forces on the western side of the compound, creating some relief from that direction, but hostile units continued advancing from the north and east. Williams brought her helicopter down through intense enemy fire, landing hard on the rocky terrain of the improvised landing zone. The aircraft took multiple hits from small arms fire, but the armored crew compartment protected the essential systems. Sergeant Martinez immediately began laying down suppressive fire to create a corridor for Sullivan's team to reach the aircraft. Sullivan made the decision to move despite the heavy enemy fire. Staying in their current position would result in everyone being killed or captured within minutes. He assigned specific responsibilities to each team member. Chen would provide rear guard action, Bradley would lead with the doctor, and Morrison and Sarah would carry Maria between them while he provided close protection. The dash across open ground was a nightmare of bullets, explosions, and desperate survival instincts. Chen's sniper rifle cracked repeatedly as he eliminated enemy soldiers, who had clear shots at the moving group. Bradley half-carried the wounded doctor while throwing his remaining grenades to suppress enemy positions. Morrison and Sarah moved as quickly as possible with the unconscious nurse. Enemy fire intensified as hostile forces realized that prisoners were escaping. Bullets struck the ground around the running group, and several came close enough to tear fabric and equipment. Sullivan returned fire while moving, his combat experience allowing him to multitask effectively under extreme stress. Every step toward the helicopter was bought with precise defensive fire. Williams kept her helicopter's engines running at maximum power, ready for immediate takeoff once all personnel were aboard. Her aircraft was taking continuous hits, and warning lights indicated damage to non-essential systems. The crew compartment was filling with smoke from electrical fires, but all critical flight systems remained operational. She had perhaps 30 seconds before the helicopter would be too damaged to fly. Chen reached the helicopter first, diving through the open door while providing covering fire for the others. Bradley arrived next with the wounded doctor, who was immediately pulled inside by crew members. Morrison and Sarah were halfway to the aircraft when Maria stopped breathing, forcing them to halt for emergency resuscitation in the middle of the firefight. Sullivan positioned himself between the wounded civilians and the heaviest enemy fire, emptying magazine after magazine while Morrison and Sarah worked frantically to restart Maria's heart. The young nurse's life hung in the balance as bullets flew overhead and explosions erupted around them. Every second of delay increased the risk for everyone involved. Rodriguez detected radio communications indicating that enemy rocket-propelled grenades were being brought into position to destroy the helicopter. Williams would have to take off immediately or risk losing the aircraft and everyone aboard. The timing couldn't have been worse, with 2 team members still exposed in the landing zone, performing emergency medical procedures. Morrison successfully restarted Maria's heart using advanced medical techniques and emergency medications. The nurse resumed breathing, though her condition remained critical. Sarah helped lift her for the final sprint to the helicopter, while Sullivan provided intensive covering fire against increasingly accurate enemy positions. They had perhaps 10 seconds before RPGs would destroy their escape route. The final approach to the helicopter was the longest 10 seconds of Sarah's life. Enemy bullets seemed to fill the air around them as she and Morrison carried Maria across the last stretch of open ground. Sullivan was behind them, firing continuously while moving backward toward the aircraft. The sound of incoming RPGs motivated everyone to move faster than they thought possible. Chen and Bradley provided covering fire from inside the helicopter, while Williams prepared for immediate takeoff. Sergeant Martinez's door gun hammered away at enemy positions, but hostile forces were too numerous and too close for suppressive fire to be completely effective. The extraction was succeeding, but barely, and the margin of safety was measured in split seconds. Morrison and Sarah reached the helicopter just as the first RPG streaked toward their position. Williams began lifting off while crew members pulled the wounded nurse inside, followed immediately by Sarah and Morrison. Sullivan was the last aboard, diving through the door as the aircraft gained altitude and enemy rockets exploded where they had been standing moments before. The helicopter climbed rapidly while taking additional hits from ground fire. Williams executed evasive maneuvers that tested the limits of her aircraft's capabilities, but enemy weapons were falling behind as altitude and distance increased. The immediate danger was passing, though the helicopter had sustained significant damage and was not yet out of hostile territory. Morrison immediately began advanced medical treatment on both wounded civilians using the helicopter's onboard medical equipment. Maria was in critical condition and required constant monitoring, while the doctor needed blood transfusions that could only be provided at a proper medical facility. Both patients had perhaps an hour before their conditions became irreversible. Sarah assisted Morrison with medical procedures while processing the emotional impact of her rescue. 4 days of isolation and fear had ended in minutes of intense combat and miraculous salvation. She thought about the SEAL team that had risked everything to save her and 2 civilians they had never met. The dedication to leaving no one behind had never been more meaningful to her. Chen reported that enemy aircraft were being scrambled to pursue their helicopter, but friendly fighter jets were moving to intercept any threats. The extraction was not complete until they reached safe airspace, and enemy forces were making desperate attempts to prevent the rescued prisoners from reaching friendly territory with valuable intelligence about their operations. Williams pushed her damaged helicopter to maximum speed while monitoring systems that were failing one by one. She had enough power and control to reach friendly airspace, but the aircraft would require extensive repairs before flying again. The mission was succeeding, but the cost in equipment and resources demonstrated the value that military commanders placed on recovering their people. Rodriguez maintained communication with command centers to arrange immediate medical facilities for the wounded civilians. Trauma surgeons were being briefed on the patient's conditions and would be ready to begin operations immediately upon arrival. The coordination between rescue and medical teams showed the military's commitment to saving every possible life. As the helicopter crossed into friendly airspace, Sullivan reflected on the mission that had begun as simple reconnaissance and evolved into a complex rescue operation. His team had succeeded against overwhelming odds, but the outcome had never been certain. Split-second decisions and flawless execution under extreme pressure had made the difference between success and tragedy for everyone involved. The military hospital buzzed with activity as the damaged helicopter approached the landing pad. Trauma surgeons had been waiting for 20 minutes, fully briefed on the incoming patients and prepared for immediate emergency surgery. Sarah watched through the aircraft's window as medical teams positioned themselves for rapid patient transfer. The moment the helicopter touched down, Lieutenant Williams executed a perfect landing, despite her aircraft's damaged systems. Hydraulic fluid leaked from multiple punctures and electrical systems sparked intermittently, but she had successfully brought everyone home. Ground crews immediately began securing the helicopter while medical teams rushed toward the open doors where Morrison was still working frantically on both wounded civilians. Maria was transferred to a waiting gurney within seconds of landing, with Morrison continuing CPR while running alongside the medical team toward the emergency room. Her heart had stopped twice during the flight, and her condition was deteriorating rapidly despite Morrison's expert care. The trauma surgeons took over immediately, wheeling her into surgery where a team of specialists waited to repair the damage from her head injury and treat the severe infection that threatened her life. The wounded doctor, Dr. Michael Santos, was conscious but weak as he was moved to a second surgical team. His shoulder wound had caused significant blood loss, and shrapnel had damaged major blood vessels that required immediate repair. Sarah provided the medical team with detailed information about his condition and the treatments she had administered during their 4 days in hiding. Sarah herself was examined by military doctors, who found her dehydrated and exhausted but otherwise unharmed. The physical stress of 4 days without adequate food or water, combined with the emotional trauma of protecting wounded civilians while hiding from enemy forces, had taken its toll. She was admitted for observation and rehydration, while psychologists prepared to help her process the traumatic experience. Sergeant Thompson arrived at the hospital within an hour, relieved beyond words to see his missing soldier alive and safe. He had spent 4 sleepless days blaming himself for losing a member of his team, and had been preparing to write letters to Sarah's parents explaining how their daughter had died under his command. Instead, he could tell them that she had survived against impossible odds through her own courage and the dedication of fellow service members who refused to abandon her. Lieutenant Commander Sullivan visited Sarah's hospital room after his team completed their mission debriefing. He wanted to personally check on the soldier they had rescued and to commend her for protecting the wounded civilians during their ordeal. Sarah thanked him repeatedly, knowing that his team had risked their lives for 3 people they had never met, simply because it was the right thing to do. The debriefing process revealed the full scope of what had occurred during the failed rescue, mission, and successful extraction. Intelligence failures had led to underestimating enemy strength in the area, but individual acts of heroism and professional competence had prevented a complete disaster. Sarah's ability to keep herself and 2 wounded civilians alive for 4 days while hiding from enemy forces was recognized as exceptional performance under extreme circumstances. Morrison received updates on both wounded civilians throughout the night. Maria required multiple surgeries to repair brain damage from her head injury and to treat the infection that had spread throughout her body. The procedures were successful, but she would need weeks of recovery and rehabilitation. Dr. Santos underwent surgery to repair damaged blood vessels and remove shrapnel, with doctors optimistic about his full recovery. The story of Sarah's rescue spread quickly through the military community, becoming an example of the military's commitment to leaving no one behind. The coordination between different service branches and the willingness of SEAL Team 6 to risk their lives for fellow service members demonstrated the bonds that united all American military personnel regardless of their specific assignments. Colonel Harrison conducted a thorough investigation of the mission failure, identifying several factors that had contributed to the dangerous situation. Intelligence reports had been incomplete, communication protocols had failed at critical moments, and enemy capabilities had been underestimated. Changes were implemented to prevent similar failures in future operations, ensuring that the lessons learned from Sarah's ordeal would protect other service members. Sarah's parents flew to the military hospital as soon as they were notified of their daughter's rescue. They had received notification that she was missing in action 4 days earlier, and had been living in constant fear that they would never see her again. The reunion was emotional and powerful, reinforcing Sarah's commitment to serving her country while making her more aware of the impact her service had on the people who loved her. The wounded civilians made remarkable recoveries over the following weeks. Maria regained consciousness after her surgeries and, despite some ongoing neurological effects, was expected to make a near-complete recovery. Dr. Santos healed quickly and returned to his humanitarian work within 2 months, though he remained grateful to Sarah for keeping him alive during their hiding ordeal. Lieutenant Williams received recognition for her exceptional flying skills during the dangerous extraction mission. Her ability to land and take off under heavy enemy fire while managing a damaged aircraft had been crucial to the mission's success. The helicopter she had flown required extensive repairs but was eventually returned to service after months of work by maintenance crews. SEAL Team 6 was commended for their flexibility and initiative in modifying their mission to include the rescue operation. Their willingness to take on additional risks without specific authorization demonstrated the type of leadership and decision-making that made Special Operations Forces so effective. The successful extraction became a case study in military schools for years afterward. Sarah returned to duty 6 weeks after her rescue, though she was initially assigned to less dangerous missions. While she recovered psychologically from her ordeal, the experience had changed her perspective on military service, making her more aware of both the risks and the profound bonds that connected service members to each other. She had experienced firsthand the commitment that led fellow soldiers to risk everything for people they barely knew. The compound where Sarah had been trapped was eventually abandoned by enemy forces, who recognized that their position had been compromised by the rescue mission. Intelligence gathered during the operation led to successful strikes against enemy leadership and supply lines, demonstrating that even missions that appeared to fail initially could produce valuable strategic benefits. Years later, Sarah remained in contact with the SEAL team members who had rescued her, considering them extended family, despite having known them for only a few hours during the most dangerous period of her life. Morrison became a particularly close friend, and they often discussed the medical challenges they had faced while keeping the wounded civilians alive under impossible circumstances. The story of Sarah's rescue became part of military tradition, told to new recruits as an example of courage, dedication, and the unbreakable bonds between service members. It demonstrated that the military's promise to leave no one behind was not just a slogan, but a sacred commitment that service members were willing to die to uphold. Maria and Dr. Santos both returned to humanitarian work after their recovery, inspired by Sarah's sacrifice to protect them and the military's commitment to rescuing them from hostile territory. They became advocates for supporting military families and veterans, using their own experience to help others understand the sacrifices made by service members and their loved ones. The mission also highlighted the importance of inter-service cooperation and communication in complex operations. The successful coordination between Army, Navy, and Air Force units during the rescue demonstrated that rivalry between service branches disappeared completely when lives were at stake. The lessons learned were incorporated into joint training exercises and operational procedures. Sarah eventually became an instructor at the military's Combat Medic School, using her experience to train the next generation of battlefield medical personnel. Her story inspired countless young soldiers to pursue medical training, knowing that their skills could mean the difference between life and death for their fellow service members in combat situations. The helicopter extraction through enemy fire became legendary among pilots, who studied Williams's techniques in decision-making under extreme pressure. Her ability to maintain control of a damaged aircraft while providing the platform for a successful rescue demonstrated the crucial role that aviation played in modern military operations and the exceptional skill required of military pilots. The bonds forged during those 4 days behind enemy lines and the dramatic rescue that followed lasted for decades, connecting people who might never have met under normal circumstances. Sarah often reflected that while the experience had been terrifying and traumatic, it had also shown her the very best of human nature in military service. The willingness of people to risk everything for others, simply because it was right.